like, geez, how am I going to ask or, to go to this conference on a call? I wrote it. I asked.
You good?
I said yes. She said,
All right. If you are not here to listen to me talk about privacy, I won't be upset if you leave. That's okay. But there's also shade in here if you want to move up. We can all get close. Okay, so today we're going to talk about evil things that you can do with privacy laws. My name is Amber Welch. I am a corporate privacy program assessor until next week when I will be moving to a company called McKinsey to run the data protection and risk program for healthcare data for their managed healthcare services. I have a bunch of certifications, so I know what I'm talking about. Right? Although I'm still waiting on the CISSP to come back because that takes like 3 months. Okay, so today we're going to talk about data subject access rights, what you can do with them for evil, and then how you can protect against that if you have the inclination to do so. All right, data subject request. Does anybody know what this is? Like 2 people? Okay. So data subject requests are a concept that was introduced in Europe. So we're living in a global privacy era now where with the advent of the GDPR, which is a law that is applicable nationally and internationally because of their ability to put fines on other countries' companies with sanctions, primarily through the UN. Now we're in an era where American companies need to consider abiding by international privacy laws in a way that they never really had to before. So data subject rights are a really primary aspect of that. And what that means is that we have to be able to honor what the Europeans view as a human right, the right to privacy, within our own data sets. So there are 4 primary rights that are involved in most privacy laws, and these are the same in Canada, Brazil, in APEC, in Europe. The right to access your data, which means that this is the right to say, I want to see what all you have on me. Show me all of the data that you've collected on my personhood. We also have the right to modification, sometimes called rectification. This is the right to update data, test it if it's incorrect. So if a company has data on you that you don't agree with, you have the ability to argue against that and make them change it. You also have the right to erasure. This is sometimes called the right to be forgotten, and most American companies panicked a lot about this. Anybody remember their companies kind of freaking out about the right to be forgotten and what they do with this? Yeah. It was a time of fear and loathing in the security center. We also have the right to portability, which is the right to request a machine-readable output of all of your data so that you can take it to a competitor. There are a lot of limitations with this, but the idea is that it's supposed to increase competition because you need to provide that data in a way that can be consumed by a competitor's data ingestion. So there are a few new challenges with, especially introduced by the GDPR. So we have this concept of metadata now where most people think in terms of personal data as PII, personally identifiable information, but that's a very human readable kind of concept. Most people think of PII as something that an individual can look at and say, yeah, that's a person's data. So metadata is now anything that is identifiable by machines as well. So IP addresses, user IDs, things that are browser fingerprints. These are things that we've always kind of known identify people, but now that's been encoded in law. So we have to kind of update our concept of what personal data is. So I don't use the term personally identifiable information or PII just to keep that kind of straight. PII is a very American concept, and it's not really applicable anymore. There's some new things we have to consider. We also have the concept of indirect identifiers related to metadata. So those indirect identifiers are things that aren't necessarily associated with a person right now, but could potentially be, could be linked. We have household and device data. This is actually new with California's privacy law. So California did a really good job of recognizing that IoT is changing how data is linked to. So I think this is going to be a really interesting way, especially to fight back against abusive facial recognition technology. And I think this will also be really interesting to see how it plays out with vehicle data, since vehicles are collecting a huge amount of personal information. They can tell when you ate too much for Thanksgiving dinner. We also have linkable data as a new challenge. So linkable data means that something which isn't necessarily personal information now, which could be combined with another data set, could become personal information. So we have to really change how we think about what constitutes personal data. Basically anything that could potentially be connected to a user's data record in the future could become personal data. And finally, controllers without control. Does anybody know what the term data controller means? No? Okay. If you're familiar with HIPAA, this is similar to the covered entity. It's the organization that is responsible for the ownership of the data. They're the ones who ultimately are going to write that check if they get a fine. So what happened in Europe, which is really interesting, this guy sued Google Spain for his information being listed in search results, and he wanted to exercise his right to be forgotten. Google Spain said, sorry, not our problem, bro, because we're just a search indexer. What do you really expect us to do? But Europe said, that is definitely your problem. You're the data controller, so you have to provide this right. Now, if you're putting yourself in the position of Google Spain, that introduces a lot of challenges, because how do you really know that that information is connected to that human? Just because he said so? So what you want to remember now is that essentially any data can be personal data. You can't really be confident that information is not going to become personal data in the future. So we really have to change our mindset and change what we consider applicable to privacy rights. So most companies just managed GDPR compliance by freaking out, panicking, hiring a bunch of lawyers, and when it comes to privacy rights, essentially just providing all of the information because they're terrified of those fines. Anybody remember the maximum 4% of total global revenue being repeated over and over again with, you know, the whites of the eyes showing? Yeah, boardrooms were full of essentially terrified executives whose response to this was, give them whatever they want, we don't want any complaints. So generally they fear non-compliance with the law or any kind of complaint more than they fear a data breach. So that's kind of where we open up this opportunity for exploits. So there are two primary ways of fulfilling data subject rights. If you are an account-based system where you have authentication, then you're able to fulfill those rights to access and deletion and modification primarily through an automated service. It's usually pretty easy if you have a very structured data set to just provide that information online. And under the law, you don't have to provide any information outside of the application if you're able to give that access through authentication. So a lot of organizations just did a self-service data subject methodology. This is similar to what you see with the Facebook deletion. Another option for account deletion, like you see with 23andMe, is a more manual process where you might authenticate to start the button pushing, but that's as far as it goes with automation. And from there, an individual actually reviews your request and makes a determination. If you're making a request for specific information that's not available through your account, then it's probably going to be a manual process. There are some organizations who have done a kind of hybrid method where you can begin the process in an automated way and maybe some components of it are automated, but it still has some kind of manual review. So there are different weaknesses and vulnerabilities with each of these types. All right, the evil things that you can do with it, the fun stuff, which we're all here for. My favorite exploit that you can do with data subject rights is what I call legal DDoS. So this is similar to sort of sending abusive or malicious legal requests, with the exception that you don't have to pay a lawyer to generate that anymore. You can submit any kind of data subject request that you would like, and it's absolutely free. You used to be able to charge up to a £10 fee when this was the data protection directive before it became global. You're no longer allowed to charge any kind of fee. So there's no disincentive, even though this can be quite intensive and labor intensive for the companies to fulfill. Another aspect of the legal DDoS which can be challenging for security teams is that similar to what you might see with a campaign for requesting some kind of political action from a senator, you see boilerplate text. This is something that generally in social engineering would raise a lot of red flags. If somebody sends you repeated text, you would think that they're phishing or attempting to get information. Now, under data subject rights, where there are educational or grassroots campaigns to help people exercise their rights, you're very likely going to see the same text repeated over and over again. You can't necessarily use that as a way to screen out malicious requests anymore. This can also be heavily distracting for security and legal teams. So if you have some other type of attack that you would like to do, this is a very cheap way to get their attention focused elsewhere because they have a limited amount of time to respond to these requests. So if you overwhelm security teams and legal teams, they're not going to be thinking about something else that you're doing if you have a different type of attack. This type of attack is also the most effective attack against organizations that would otherwise have a very strong privacy program because they might be really investing quite a lot of resources in it, so then it would end up being even more expensive for them than an organization that was less compliant. And finally, this is very, very likely to happen after a data breach just organically because once you're in the news, and people see that you've had some kind of security incident, they're going to want to know what data you had. So they're probably going to go and ask for their information. I think this is probably something that you would want to include in an incident response plan because this is just kind of how people work. They want to know what potentially was lost. So this man submitted a data subject request to a midwifery clinic in the UK. They wanted to heavily redact it, and they paid £140,000 to a legal firm to do that. So during this time, he only had to pay £10 to submit that request. Now it's completely free. So it doesn't sound that expensive until you think about how it can really add up to actually fully comply with these requests. So the average, the UK is the only place where I could find information on this, but the average manually fulfilled data subject request costs £145. So that's quite a lot. If you had a lot of people making those requests at the same time, you could easily tax the financial resources of that organization really quickly. So as an example of this, I thought I would ask Twitter why they have decided that I'm a man. This is in your Twitter settings. If you've never poked around in them, they will make their best guess about your gender, and I apparently have too many tech interests for a woman. So I log on and go to their portal where you're able to submit questions to the privacy office. About 2 weeks later, you probably won't be able to read this, but they send back this response. So they paid a lawyer to sit down and write a nice response to me about why they think that I'm a man and what I can do about it. So after they sent this response to me, I could continue asking them questions. I could keep going with follow-up questions until they decided that it was enough evidence that I was abusing the system. And there's not really any kind of explanation of how you decide that it's malicious or abusive. It's just when the company feels they have enough evidence to make that argument, which is probably quite a while. So you could spend a long time pestering any kind of privacy office with irritating questions that they have to pay for. Does anybody remember seeing this float around Twitter? It's ship your enemies GDPR. Anybody remember ship your enemies glitter?
Yes.
This is the ship your enemies glitter of privacy law. So what this does is it provides you boilerplate text and it makes every single allowable request under the GDPR. And you can send it to a company and ruin their day. So there are a couple of organizations that are doing this, but it's, if people realize just how damaging this could become to companies, I think it would be even more popular. And the other thing to remember with this is it's perfectly legal and they're obligated to abide by everything that, that is valid under the law. So there may be a few items that they don't have to respond to, but this makes every possible request and they have to decide what things they're obligated to respond to. And they also have to explain to you what things that they don't have to respond to. So even if they don't have that kind of obligation, they still have to spend time making that argument. So the most problematic exploit is general phishing. So social engineering and phishing is the primary attack against data subject requests. You are able to ask for all of this information verbally. There's no ability to say we don't service data subject requests that are submitted by phone. You can't force somebody to do it by email or through authentication. So that means you get to make a phone call and talk to Tier 1 tech support, which is every phisher's favorite target, right? They don't get a lot of training. They're probably not in that job for a long time and might be quite junior. And they're also trying to be helpful because they don't want you to complain about them. Another thing that you can do is to ask for the privacy officer. So what you can do from this is make the person you're speaking to a little bit nervous. You can get information about how the security and privacy office is set up. So there's a lot of information about the inner workings that you're able to get through phishing attacks. You can claim that you don't have access to the email that they have on file, and they still have to be able to provide you with that information. There's no clause that says if you don't have that email anymore, then you don't get those data rights. But it's very infrequent for organizations to have any kind of process set up to deal with that sort of situation. You can also use this information to get other identifying information about a person that you're trying to get data about. So when you think about CEO fraud and spear phishing, this would be a really key way to do that. You could attack an organization that you knew had data on them, on that individual, which was not the actual ultimate target, and get additional information. And it's highly unlikely that that organization would actually tell that individual that there had been a malicious attack. At best, they would say no, and just deny it. So this is an area where you would be able to get a lot of information about one single person and then move on to another organization from there with the information that you got from that record. This is also a really excellent way to match up data sets. If you have two different records and you think it might be the same person, you can try to use some of the information from the second record to get access to the first organization. If it works, you know that you have matched up those data sets. You might also be able to escalate to higher value data. So a lot of organizations will correctly implement escalated requirements for more sensitive data, but sometimes they don't do that if they've already identified you at a lower level. Another thing that you're able to do with phishing, which is probably the most problematic, is the case of common names. So how many of you would say that you have a very common name? You get emails from other people? Yeah, I get emails from everybody. So what does a name really tell us about who a person is? Really not that much, right? I mean, how many people have John Smith as their name? So an individual's identity is not necessarily the same thing as their identification. So this is the primary concept. If you remember nothing else from this talk, remember that names are not the same thing as identities. So it would be very easy for me, very likely, to impersonate another Amber Welch with my government-issued identification if an organization is accepting passports and driver's license as proof of ID, but they don't have any other information that would identify that as fraudulent, like the actual ID number or the address that would be listed on that identification document. Another thing that's kind of concerning is that a lot of Americans still think that GDPR is applicable to EU citizens everywhere. It's not, but you can scare companies into believing that they have some kind of compliance requirement that they don't, and they're not prepared to handle. So they're very likely to just give information away because they don't know anything about the law, and they're just scared because they see these huge fines, and that's the extent of their knowledge about it. So, some of the things that you can do, we went over phishing uses. Yes, you can confirm profile data sets. This phishing aspect, is highly likely for executive fraud. And that's one area where if you've had CEO or CFO attacks that have been successful in the past, you've already kind of targeted yourself as being an organization that's kind of key for this. So it's an area where you might want to educate executives as well to be looking for this. So there was actually an organization who did research, who attempted to get data leakage from large organizations with these kind of tactics, and they were able to get 27% of those companies to provide user information. So some of what I'm talking about today sounds a little obvious, right? It seems kind of stupid that you would even have to say this, but companies are giving out this information left and right with very little actual verification of identities. It's very uncommon for them to do high quality data verification, identity verification for this data. So we know that there's currently a black market for this information, and there has been for quite some time. A few other things that you can do with malicious data requests are guerrilla marketing. Some privacy solutions have been providing these data requests to organizations just to pester them and convince them that it's too hard to fulfill those requests alone. Maybe you should buy our product to do it for you, which seems like a really bad marketing tactic, but, you know, I guess if it works. You can also do competitor research. This is really useful if you don't want to hire a privacy consultant or anybody to do the work yourself. You can just submit this request to a company and see what they do, and you might get some information about what you want your own process internally to look like. Or you might notice that they're very weak on privacy, and you can make that a differentiator for yourself. Disgruntled employees are another key area where these rights can be abused. This has been done in Europe for a really long time. Employees leave, they get angry, and then they submit a bunch of requests. It's sort of easy for them to do, and it's a very common way to just pester a company that you have bad blood with. In a similar vein, a lot of lawyers are recommending that in employment law cases, the person actually make those requests as a way of doing very free e-discovery, because usually you would have to pay for it. It might have a longer timeline. But in this case, if you can get the information that you need for free in 30 days, that might be a lot more effective than going through actual legal discovery. One of the most concerning malicious uses, though, is the case of intimate partner violence, stalking, and harassment. So especially where people live together, you get a lot of information about that individual, right? It's very easy to impersonate a spouse or a domestic partner. So a person might be able to get a lot of location data, messaging history, purchase data, even information like whether they've been contacting domestic violence shelters. So if you're thinking about looking at an organization's privacy program and you want to get an estimate of how strong their program is, you can look at the privacy policy. If it's really vague or outdated or very short and doesn't have a lot of information, it's very likely that the rest of their privacy program is very weak as well. It might be a good target to do this type of exploit. If they don't have any privacy or security officer, that's another big cue that they probably haven't invested a lot of resources and don't have the expertise to make a lot of good decisions on privacy. And if you want to generate one of these alluvial diagrams so that you don't actually have to read the privacy policy, because nobody does, I don't even want to read them, they're very boring. This is pribot.org, and it will parse all of that information into general types of pieces of information that are in privacy policies. So a very strong privacy policy will look like this spaghetti mess, and a very weak one won't have much information in it at all. So you can get a kind of high level estimate of the depth of that program. So other primary profiles for very weak targets are organizations that have a lot of indirect identifiers, especially ones that don't have any kind of account. If you can't associate data with an account, but you still have to provide that information to someone and you don't know for sure that it's connected to a name, then you might have a lot of trouble correctly matching any data to the right data subject, the right user. Also, international charities tend to be subject to a lot of different privacy laws, but they don't have a lot of resources. They want to be helpful, and they also don't want to be fined. So they're a target that is highly likely to provide information. Social media startups also tend to be a little bit weak on privacy laws because they are more focused on consuming a lot of information that they might be able to monetize later, and usually haven't gotten to the point of worrying too much about compliance or those kind of annoying things like governance. Small and medium businesses with minimal regulation are another aspect of where you might get a lot of privacy weakness. So this might be something like entertainment venues, retailers, hotels. So organizations that really have the most basic privacy requirements in the US, but do have some kind of responsibility to abide by these rights. Also, any kind of application that doesn't have two-factor authentication is really likely to be a good target for this, because if you can compromise the data, if you can compromise the login, and they're providing all of this information through that authenticated portal, then you get all of the data provided right there. So as an example, Spotify really rather infamously refuses to add two-factor authentication. So somebody actually had this happen to them where their account was compromised, the login was compromised, and all of the data was taken because it's very easy to download. So if you want to actually try this out, you can do this with Twitter. You go online, you authenticate into your account, and then you go into the settings, and all you do is you just click this button to request your data. And it's, I think that this is a partially automated service and someone actually ends up approving it. So it took about 2 hours for them to generate this for me. There was no email sent to my address. There was no notification. There's no UI banner. Nothing would indicate to a user that this had been done on their account at the time that it's requested. The only thing that tells you that there is actually a request that's been pending is when it's completed and you get an email letting you know that you can download it. They have since changed this. I told them that this was a very bad idea. Don't tell people to ignore signs of account compromise. So the thing to take away from this is that even a very large organization with a lot of extremely sensitive data, Twitter's been around for what, a decade? Still has very basic flaws in their privacy program, partly because they don't tend to be looked at by security professionals who would obviously see this and think of it as a flaw. So all you have to do to get that data is you just go back into the same portal, click download, and this is everything that you get. So you get the entirety of your account history. You get messages, media, location data, metadata. So if you lost this in the space of 2 hours, think about everything that would be gone. And before Twitter changed the one sentence, which I'm sure will protect everyone now, somebody could do this multiple times. You would be able to request this every month if you wanted to with a compromised account, and someone would probably never know. So what's bothersome about this is that when I started doing research, I found that they had been talking about this, academics have been talking about this for over 40 years. We've known that this is a problem for decades. There's been an active black market for decades, and yet the only people who are actively discussing this issue are academics. I don't even see privacy governance professionals talking about this very frequently. So it seems like something has gone wrong. There's a disconnect between security professionals who would be really key at helping solve this problem and the actual bad actors who are taking advantage of these weaknesses. So what can we actually do about it? Some defense strategies. So when you're thinking about how to set up a data subject request process, there are 3 primary things you're trying to balance. You don't want to do any kind of invasive identity checks. So don't be asking for, someone's blood type and passport scans just to get their address and that's all the data that you have on them. Don't ask for information that is excessive in response to the kind of data that they're requesting. But you also don't want to deny access completely. You can deny access if you can't validate that person's identity, but you can't just blanket deny everyone as a security measure. But finally, if you do provide that information to a malicious attacker, that constitutes a data breach. So we have this sort of trifecta of problems, and we want to hit a good balance in between where you're not making it too impossible to exercise these rights, but you're not providing that information to someone who is the incorrect person. So a common way that the DSR process works is that a privacy request comes into a generic inbox. There's usually no security review on it. It just gets sorted into valid or invalid. If it requires any kind of manual processing, it goes to maybe a DBA or the IT team, and then that information is delivered to the user. That's kind of basically how it goes. One thing that I've never seen in organizational privacy processes is any kind of process for what they actually require to identify the person. Sometimes there's a statement that just says, identify the data subject. That's not very helpful because the person who's fulfilling that response is basically left to make up in their own mind what that means and what constitutes valid identification. I've also never really seen organizations deal with the problem of validating a mailing address that wasn't already on file for requests that the person asks for a paper copy, which you're allowed to do. So this is an area where it might be very easy to bypass not having email access. So some of the challenges with identifying a person is that you have to link that data with one individual, especially where you don't necessarily have a name. That might be very challenging to do. You can't require an account to fulfill these requests, which would be the easiest way to get around this. You can't collect excessive information, and you can't make the ID process burdensome for the individual. But unfortunately, the gov.uk verify service is only 51% successful, which is their own metric. So it's probably likely that it's even worse than that. Also, ID documents are really just extra sensitive information if you don't already have something that would help connect those ID documents to that person. Now, you've just added to the sensitivity of the records that you have on file, and you've made no progress in identifying that individual. And in the worst case, you might be connecting those records to the wrong person's information and then provide that out incorrectly at a future date. So remember, you don't have to see identification documents. Identification is not the key way to identify a data subject. And this seems kind of obvious, but Google still did this up until a few years ago, would ask for passport information as a means of verifying identity. So how easy is it to get passport scans? I mean, we use them, you give them out at your hotel whenever you travel internationally. So the idea that you could just take a passport scan and then get all of the information that Google has on an individual is kind of terrifying, right? So there's really only two very good methods. So you can do passport scans and identity documents, but only if you already had collected that information, that ID number previously, and it was associated with the account. If you don't have that information, don't ask for ID because it's useless. If you do ask for that information, you do still want to see an actual scan of the document because you should just assume that ID numbers like that are compromised already, and that information is pretty easily available. But the best method for identifying a data subject is to confirm transaction history that's associated with that account with the person who is making that request. So, for example, in a hotel, you would maybe ask for the member record and the date of the last stay. So you want to try to avoid requesting information that would be obtained very easily from the same source, and make sure that you ask for more than one piece of information. So if we go have a beer at a hotel bar and you pick up my receipt afterwards, or I just leave it on the table, you can't just call that hotel and say, oh, my name is this and my date of last day was June whatever. Does anybody know what this is? Can you guys see the terrible pixel art? Yes, James Bond is a fan. Yeah. This is in Puerto Rico. It's the Arecibo radio telescope. So this funky pixel art is the Arecibo radio message. So this was sent out into the great beyond and is supposed to be a means of communication through basic mathematical concepts. And the idea behind this is that whoever intercepts this message doesn't necessarily know who we are. If we got something back that was the same message reflected back or with some slight changes, we wouldn't know who was sending it. The purpose of a message like this is to establish shared history, shared transactional history. So you would be able to reference this message and know that you had established communication. So the identification of us, the sender, or the receiver is kind of irrelevant. So when you're thinking about identifying data subjects, you want to be able to think in terms of the transactional history that's been established and less about the name of the data subject. Names are basically irrelevant here. So you also want to have graduated identity requirements. This is the easiest way to get around that challenge of avoiding abusive identity checks and burdensome data, but also providing sufficient ID checks. So if you have high sensitivity health or financial information, political information, things like that, then you would want to ask for additional information to verify that person. So if it's just basic data like address and maybe how many ice cream cones you had in a month, then it's not really that critical. So you can ask for less information and that would be sufficient. You should also assume that identity numbers are compromised. Can't say this enough. Just assume that driver's license numbers and passport numbers already exist on the internet and are not a really good means of identifying someone. A really good way to feel confident in the ID requirements of your program are the NIST Digital Identity Guidelines. I don't know if anybody uses NIST for anything, but they're a good way to be very confident that you can support your argument when you say that this is a regulator comes knocking and complains about your program or someone else has complained about it. You can say, we use NIST. We feel confident in this method. So for automated data subject requests, those things like Twitter and Spotify, you want to make sure that you always re-authenticate the session. If somebody just walks out logged in at the library, make sure that you're not letting anybody who comes up just take all of that information and download it immediately. Obviously, that would be catastrophic for that individual. You should also consider implementing something like a UI banner so that a data subject who actually owned the account, the true user, would have some time to see that there was some kind of request that was pending and be aware of that before it was fulfilled. I also think it's a good idea to add some waiting time. Twitter provided my information in only 2 hours. But that's not really necessary. You could wait a week and provide a hold on that so that a legitimate user would have an opportunity to check their email, check their notifications, log into the platform, and be aware that there was a compromised account issue. So make it easy for users to recognize that there's a problem. Also, you can campaign for 2FA. Even if your application has 2FA on it, make sure your product managers are doing educational campaigns, motivating users to add 2FA, because it takes a lot of prompting sometimes to get users to actually set up two-factor authentication. Even SMS is better than nothing. So if you want to identify when you have a potential attack happening on your privacy program, there are a few red flags that you can keep as metrics, which will help you recognize when there might be suspicious activity. So anybody who is requesting a mailed copy of data to an address that was not already on file would be a very big red flag. Common names should always have, if you're doing manual processing, common names should always have a higher level of review since they're more likely to be targets for abuse. Any kind of requests that are based on indirect identifiers could potentially be an issue, especially if you don't have high confidence that your data is not mixed with other people. And requests that don't have any kind of account or history on them. So if you aren't using authentication for your data subject request, then this really would be a good case for additional vetting for those requests. Frequent similar requests or repeated text. So you might find that you're getting a lot of that boilerplate text. Those would be potentially valid, but if you're getting just a few one-off things where they look like individual emails, but they just are copying pieces or sentences, then it's likely that you actually have the same individual who's trying to make it look like different requests. And generally, any unexplained increase in a data subject request volume would be a potential red flag. So if you know that you've been in the news because of a data breach or there's something that it would explain the increase, then that's fine. Just do your best to wade through them and don't cry too much. But if you don't know why you're getting that many, then it's possible that you have some kind of attack. So remember, providing information to the wrong individual is a data breach. You have to report this. It's a data breach and should be treated as such. It's not just a general mistake. Okay, that's a lot. I know, a lot to take in. So here's my cat. I don't know if you can see him with this like lighting here. We're almost done. So the best defense that you have ultimately is just to deny data subject requests. You're perfectly within your rights to say, no, we can't fulfill that. I'm sorry. You won't get in trouble if you, in good faith, deny a request. So all you have to do is tell the data subject why you're denying the request and let them know how to escalate it to the proper authority if they would like to complain about it or request additional review. So you're not going to get in trouble just because you said no. That's not a valid reason for a complaint. So there are a few different reasons that you're allowed to reject requests. I'll go over kind of the high levels, but at the end, there's a slide that has a GitHub link where I've broken down all of the reasons, both that you can use for the exploits if you want to do some pen testing or red teaming on this, as well as the defense text that you're able to use as a way of rejecting or pushing back on requests. So you're allowed to reject repetitive or abusive requests. There's not a lot of good information about what constitutes a repetitive or abusive request, but if you keep getting repeated submissions from the same person, then you would be able to turn them down. If you can't confirm the identity, but you can prove that you did try and you just don't have the level of confidence that is required for your information, then you're able to say, no, I'm sorry, we can't fulfill that. Any data that's not clearly associated with a confirmed identity. So you may have a case where you partially fulfill a request, but there's some additional information that you don't have a high level of confidence is associated with that individual, so you can withhold some data and only provide a portion of it. You also are allowed to reject requests that are impossible or requiring disproportionate effort. I'm not really sure what they mean by this, to be honest. I've never really seen use cases where people have successfully done this. It's very possible that if you used this as a reason, then a malicious attacker wouldn't continue any further because they wouldn't really know how to argue against it. But you are allowed to do this. You're also allowed to say that providing information would adversely affect the rights or freedoms of other individuals. This would especially be the case where data is mixed between people and you weren't able to separate it, or you might have to redact it very heavily. You are able to do partial fulfillments where you've redacted a lot of information, and you can do that to protect other individuals. Someone asked a question at this talk recently about whether you could request someone else's message data if you knew they were talking about you. No, you can't, because that's obviously interfering with somebody else's privacy rights to, talk smack behind your back. Portability requests that aren't automated or feasible are also a way that you can turn things down. So you don't actually have to design new functionality if it's not already in the system. If you don't already have the ability to export that data, you don't have to go to great lengths to redesign your system to make this work. So what I want you guys to remember from today is that you can have security without privacy, but we can't have privacy without security, and we really need the attention of the security team. We need security reviews. We need security people to be integrated with the privacy process, because lawyers don't tend to think in terms of security and are a lot more likely to give out information without really considering some of these risks. So if we can get security people to kind of bridge that divide, I know that legal teams and technical people are kind of like oil and water at times, but try to make friends across the aisle, get involved in the process, and see if you can help in a way that they will accept it. All right. If you would like to see the sources, they're here. These are also available online. All the slides are available online. You can take pictures if you would like. And if you would like to look at the GitHub, slides and references are available there. And you can also talk to me on Twitter. I love hearing stories about people's privacy programs and what they're doing. Anybody have any questions? No? All right. Excellent. Thank you. Oh, one question.
Make sure that the right security and privacy checks in place to make sure that you are being safe.
Yeah.
How often do you Do most companies, how do they verify that you're European? Do most companies check that kind of information?
So, okay, the question is, how do companies verify that you're European? So the GDPR is actually only applicable to those who are resident within the EU. So if it doesn't matter because it's not based on citizenship. So just being a European doesn't really give you these rights. You have to be resident within the EU. And generally speaking, even if you're a European citizen and your data just incidentally gets into an American system, that doesn't mean they have to give you this information. They can say, we don't target Europeans, so it's not really our problem. So this is primarily affecting international companies or, for example, social media that doesn't geofence. So just being a European citizen is pretty much irrelevant for this.
Right, but if I'm like a social engineer trying to get the data of someone,
Mm-hmm.
I just like mass blast an email to a bunch of different companies saying, hey, this person trying to request this data against someone, and I'm relying, like, as a social engineer, they don't have that privacy check in place to make sure I am what I'm saying I am.
Mm-hmm.
On this data. I guess a mass blast of like 100 different emails. Is that like a pretty...
Yeah, that would be effective.
Authorization. Right. Like you said, I'm allowed to make this request over email.
Yeah, you are able to make those email requests. So a lot of organizations will list a privacy email address in their privacy policy. So you could probably even scrape the web for those and send out a generic email request if you wanted. Yeah?
So to kind of follow up on one of his threads, so one of the responses that you mentioned, a company can respond by saying that we haven't been able to sufficiently identify you. Mm-hmm. Can the company respond by saying we don't think we're obligated to provide you this information based on data that we have about, for example, where you reside?
So would they be able to deny you by saying you didn't reside in the EU?
Yes.
Yes, you would be able to do that. Most organizations don't have enough information to really take a strong stance on that. So generally organizations have just provided the same rights to everyone globally because they're more worried about accidentally denying somebody who is resident in the EU rather than providing the information to someone who doesn't necessarily have the right.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So the company I work for, we're based in the U.S. only, so we only have we only have United States customers for the most part. Has the law in California gone into effect, and at a high level, how is it similar, and or does it differ from?
Okay, so the question is, for an organization that's in the U.S. only with only American customers, how does the California law differ from this? So the California law is still kind of in flux, which is why I don't focus on it too much in this because there were some amendments. There's the possibility that a federal law will override. So it's kind of hard to take a strong stand on it right now. It is very similar. It does have similar requirements. It's a little bit more limited. You don't have every single type of right that you do under the GDPR, but they have expanded the metadata and indirect identifiers. So they provided more, they expanded the definition of personal information a little bit more than the GDPR did. Nonprofits are not under the scope, and it's more focused on the sale of information. So it's less applicable to like a healthcare organization, for example, that didn't sell your information. So you're a lot more likely to run into cases where a company genuinely isn't responsible for providing the information because they're not in scope. Did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Linkable data, when you talked about earlier in the presentation, can you give an example of what type of data is like
Of which type of data?
linkable?
Oh, linkable data. Okay, so what is linkable data? So let's say that you have, This would maybe be a case where there's facial recognition data. You got into a database from just public information. They didn't necessarily have you associated to any kind of user. You're just incidental facial recognition data that got captured. But then later you enroll in the system and that data would now be linkable because even though it wasn't connected to a person previously, it could be in the future. So anything that was associated to that kind of generic facial signature would then become all that person's personal information.
Would that be like browser fingerprinting?
Browser fingerprinting, yeah. Yeah. So if this is applicable to tracking technologies. If you're doing something to track people and you're not necessarily associating it to a specific human being, it kind of doesn't matter. That doesn't really get you away from having to abide by those rights. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a clear definition of what reside means in this context?
Of what?
Reside means.
Oh, reside.
Yeah.
Okay, so
How long do you actually reside in Europe for
okay, so how long do you have to reside in Europe to be resident? It doesn't say. So in theory, even if you are transient, so you could go to the EU, you could do a layover and request all this information, and there's not really anything saying that you can't do that. They made it pretty vague. It's not based on your visa status, your citizenship, really anything else. You can just be passing through, essentially. You might have a hard time actually fulfilling that argument in court, but a company it's in their best interest just to provide those rights to you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.